I'm a huge Twitter nerd. And if you're also on Twitter, I encourage you to engage with two ongoing conversations now or after the talk. One is #MyReconciliation, which is a number of voices exploring what reconciliation means to them. And the second one is #ReadTheTRC-report. It's a huge victory to me personally to be addressing such a large audience about the topic of residential schools and reconciliation, and I'll tell you why. As a child, my mother, who was a residential school survivor, often tried to educate other people about her truth, and her truth too often was denied, minimized, or diminished. So the fact that I'm welcomed here and able to speak openly without being silenced or shamed says a lot to me about positive change within my lifetime, and it gives me great hope for the future of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal relationships in this country. The photo that you see here behind me was taken this summer by my mother during a hike that we took. My 16-year-old son joined us on this hike. This hike is, the landform that this photo was taken from is called the canoe that brought our people here, and it's a part of our oral history. It's very important to me to take my son to different places in our territory and teach him about our oral history. The next generation represents the link between the past and the future, and he's raised with the understanding that he has a responsibility to carry forward our oral history and our culture to the next generation. My reconciliation would be an education system where all adults recognize and celebrate and honor the role that our children play in our families and our societies. My reconciliation would involve an education system where all First Nations children are held to high expectations and are provided with the skills and prerequisites to succeed in the 21st century. My reconciliation would also involve respectful representation of Aboriginal people within the public education system. There are a lot of resources to do so, such as the First Peoples Principles of Learning, which the new BC curriculum was actually, it's a key pillar of the new BC curriculum. If you aren't already familiar with the First Peoples Principles of Learning, I encourage you to check them out. For the past 2 years, I have been involved in the development of FNESC's residential schools and reconciliation resources. And during this journey, I've met a lot of First Nations community members as well as teachers who have come to me and shared with me their deep commitment towards teaching other people about residential schools and reconciliation, and their belief that there needs to be more awareness on this issue. And I'm really inspired by all the people who have taken the time to share their aspirations about the future with me. During the development of our resources, the advisory team came to understand a number of powerful concepts about teaching about residential schools and reconciliation, and we embedded these concepts into the curriculum. I'll share with you today the 3 concepts that stood out the most for me. The first concept is that when thinking about, talking about, or teaching about residential schools and reconciliation, it's important to remember that before contact, before residential schools, we as Indigenous people had our own rich bodies of knowledge. We had our own understandings about the relationship between somebody who has knowledge and somebody who is receiving knowledge. We had our own systems of passing knowledge on. And it's important to do this because, first of all, it starts things on a positive note where Aboriginal people aren't portrayed negatively from the get-go. Rather, it celebrates and honors our strengths. The second reason why it's important to do this is because unless you understand that something of incredible value existed before residential schools, you can never truly understand what was taken from survivors during residential schools. When we talk about revitalization, we're often talking about linguistic and cultural revitalization, the revitalization of those bodies of knowledge and those methods of passing knowledge on. And revitalization is part of reconciliation. So I would say, unless you understand and can celebrate the body of knowledge that existed before residential schools, you can never truly understand what reconciliation means. The second thing that is important when thinking about, talking about, or teaching about residential schools is to celebrate the strength of survivors. Survivors are too often portrayed in the media as passive recipients of government genocidal policy. But and this advice actually came from my friend and author, Nicola Campbell, who, when talking to survivors, focused on their strengths. How did you survive in school? What ways did you use to resist when you were in school? And then that way it highlights the agency of the survivors. And it's also important to celebrate the courage that the survivors had when they began legal proceedings against the Government of Canada and against the churches and kick-started the process of reconciliation that we're in right now. The third thing to remember when thinking about, talking about, or teaching about residential schools is to always be forward-looking towards reconciliation. The act of teaching about residential schools or learning about residential schools yourself as an educator is an act of reconciliation in and of itself. In terms of broader institutional change, the Truth and Reconciliation recently released the executive summary of its final report, and I encourage you to familiarize yourself with the TRC report and its recommendations. It outlines a set of broad institutional changes that will happen, and we all have a role to play in reconciliation. Broad institutional changes that need to happen in order to achieve reconciliation at the institutional level. I have just one thought I'd like to leave you with. Those are my three big things to remember when thinking about reconciliation. But my big thought that I'd like to leave you with is that we're at the very beginning of something that could be big. Chief Justice Sinclair said, "It took us 150 years to get into this mess, and it'll take us 150 years to get out." Right now, we're at the very beginning of this movement called reconciliation. It could either create lasting, meaningful institutional change and take us towards a more just and peaceful Canada, or it could fizzle out. The degree to which this movement is successful depends on people like you and me. Tsilhqot'in.